My name is Dan Wellman, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at the Accordion widget. It's nice to use and has a pretty simple API, so it's a good one to start on for those of you that haven't used the framework before. If you have used it before, don't worry, you're not going to get bored because the Accordion has recently undergone an extensive API redesign, so even if you think you know it inside out, you might not. So stay awake at the back there. The underlying markup required for the widget is quite fixed, but it's also quite straightforward. All we need is an outer containing element that the accordion method is called on. So let's just open up a code editor now. I'm going to use Visual Studio Express 2012 for web. It's a free IDE. It is made by Microsoft and it's not actually open source, so it might offend some people, but I found it to be a pretty good IDE generally, so I choose to use it. You don't have to. Feel free to use whichever code editor you would rather use. Here is our empty website. So I'm just going to add a new HTML page now. And we'll call this one Accordion because that's the widget that we're going to be looking at. We'll give it a title. We'll just set it to UTF-8 just because that's what we should generally do most of the time. Okay, so, right. The underlying markup for an accordion should consist of alternating H3 elements, which become the accordion headings, and div elements, which become the accordion panels. So we can add as many of these as we wish, but remember to add both the heading and body for each panel. So let's just add a few now. We'll start out with an outer containing div, and we'll just give this an ID so that we can select it easily. And we better spell the name of the widget correctly. So we'll just make a small one, just with a few headings and panels. So we want to link to the jQuery UE style sheet. Okay, and obviously we also need to link to jQuery and jQuery UE. Okay, so everything's in place now. What we want to do is initialize the widget once the page has loaded. So let's add another script element now. And we'll just use jQuery's standard document ready shortcuts. And then we can just select the outer container. And we call the accordion method. And we obviously need a dot there. Excellent. Okay, so let's take a look at that in a browser. And here we can see the accordion has been rendered. By default, the first panel is open, and by default, one panel must be open at all times, so we can't close it. If we click on one of the other headings, then the panel slowly opens. So pretty standard stuff. So newcomers to the framework will notice that the method we call to initialize the widget is the same as the widget's name. Every component in the framework has a method that is the same as its name, and it is this method that is called to initialize whichever component it is. Each of the components also have other methods that can be called in order to invoke different behavior programmatically. But these methods are called in a slightly different way, so to keep things simple, I'm going to refer to the initialization method of each component as the init method, and any other method just as the name of the method. Does that make sense? Good. It will do by the end. Don't worry if it seems a bit odd now. So the API for each widget consists of configurable options that control how the widget appears or behaves, a suite of methods that can be called to make the widget do something, and a range of events that are fired at interesting points during the widget's lifecycle, so when it gets interacted with. The accordion widget exposes the following configuration options: active, animate, collapsible, disabled, event, height style, and icons. It should be obvious what some of these options are for. The disabled option clearly sets the widget to be in a disabled state so that it cannot be interacted with. And the styling is a little bit different as well, so the widget kind of appears duller and grayed out slightly. Some of these options are common between all widgets, and some are shared just by a few. Some are unique to this particular widget. So as we go through the course, you'll get to learn which options you can use with any of the widgets and which are specific to particular widgets. These options can be set in one of two ways. We can pass a configuration object to the init method in order to set the options when the widget is initialized, or we can use a method to set or change options after the widget has been initialized. We'll look at the configuration object in this lesson and the method way in a later lesson. So for example, by default, the first panel of the accordion is open when the widget is initialized. If we wanted to show the second panel instead, we could use a configuration object. So let's do that now. So the configuration object is passed to the init method, and the option that we want to set is active. And we'll just set that to be number 1. And like an array, the panels are 0 based. So the panel 1 is actually panel 0 programmatically. So by setting active 1, we're saying that we want the second panel to be visible. So let's just go back to the page and refresh that. And now you can see the second panel is open instead. Let's look at a few more options. The animate option controls how the animation works when showing a new panel in the accordion. So by default, the panels will slide down if we're opening a panel higher up than the current panel, and slide up when we're opening a lower panel. So yeah, that slides down. If we go back to this one, that slides up. So it's quite simple. If we wanted to disable the animations completely, then we could set the animate option to false. So now when we open them, they just open straight away. The animate option can also take an integer. So if we set that, say, to 100, then that becomes the number of milliseconds that the default animation runs for. So if we refresh that now, we should find that they open pretty quickly. So that's pretty nice. And we can also set the animate option to a string value instead. And the value that we set then becomes the easing that's used. So if we set that to ease out bounce, which is a standard jQuery UE easing method, when we go back and refresh the page now, we get a little bounce at the end. So that's kind of nice. So you should note that if you're not using the full library, you might need to include the effects core file to get the easing types. And we can also specify one more type for the animate option, which is an object. The object can take 3 properties. The first 2 are the easing and duration, so we are able to set both of these at once if we wish. And the third property is a special property called down, which itself accepts an object with easing and duration properties. This allows us to set a different animation for opening panels that are lower than the current panel. So if we wanted to use it, we would do this instead. So let's change this to the object. So we can set the easing. So remember, this is for ones that are higher. So we'll just set that to linear, which is like the default one. And we'll give it the nice snappy short duration again. And now we can use the down option. And remember I said that takes an object as well. So now we can set a different easing, and we'll go back to the ease out bounce. And we'll set this one to be slightly slower. So let's put this to a duration of 300. So when we go back to the page now, the top one will drop down because it's higher, so that will have the bounce and be slightly slower. And these two, now that the first one is open, these two will both go up, so these will have the linear one. Bounce, linear. And it gives us total control over how the animation occurs. So that's quite a useful option in the accordion's case. So another option we can use is collapsible, and that controls whether all panels can be closed at the same time. So by default, it's set to disabled. So one panel must be open at all times. If we set that to true, then when we go back to the page now, we should find that we can close all of them. So they can all be closed at once. So that's quite a common option that you might find yourself setting frequently. And another interesting option actually is the height style option, which controls how much space the widget takes up. So by default it's set to auto, so all of the panels will be equal in height, and this height is determined by the panel that has the most content. Other values we can set are fill, which makes the accordion take up as much vertical space as its container allows, regardless of the height of individual panels. Or we can set it to content, which makes the widget change size according to the height of the currently active panel. The event option is used to specify the event that triggers showing a panel. It's set to click by default, so if we wanted, we could change it to mouse over, and then the panels would open as soon as the pointer moved onto a heading without the heading having to be clicked. Also, you see we've got some icons here next to each panel. We've got these little triangles, and they change to show that the panel is open, even though clearly the panel is open. It's quite a common feature of any interactive thing like this to have some kind of icon. If we wanted to change these icons to a different image, then we can use the icon option. We need to specify an object for this option, which has two keys, header and active header. Header is the icon for a closed panel heading, and active header is the icon for an open panels heading. So that's again pretty simple to use. So now let's look at the methods that the accordion exposes. These are destroy, disable, enable, option, refresh, and widget. So it might seem like this widget exposes a lot of methods, but actually none of these methods are unique to the widget. Every single widget in the framework has these methods, and they all work in exactly the same way. Some widgets do have unique methods, just not the accordion. We won't look at any of these methods in any great detail, but we will look at one of them just so that you can see how methods are invoked. So remember how I said earlier that each widget has an init method as well as other methods? Well, to call another method, we actually still use the init method, but we specify the name of the method we want to call as the first argument of the init method, instead of passing a configuration object. If the method itself takes additional arguments, these are provided as individual arguments after the name of the method that we want to use. So let's just say we want to use the disable method. So maybe we want to add a button that will let us disable the accordion. And then we can add a handler for this button. And we'll just do that using jQuery's on method. And all we want to do is disable the accordion. So within the event handler, we select the accordion again, and we call the accordion init method, but we pass the name of the method as a string as the first argument. So the name of the method is disable, and that's all we need to do. So let's go back to the page. It's enabled at the moment, lovely. And now it's disabled. So it's grayed out, it's hardly visible at all, and it doesn't react to clicks or hovers or anything at all. So that's how methods are called in jQuery UI. They're all called in the same way. The only difference obviously is the name of the method that we're calling and any optional arguments that may be passed as well. So we will be calling other methods in different lessons throughout the course, so don't worry. So that might be slightly different to how you might expect to call a method in JavaScript, but don't worry, you soon get used to it, and it does help to keep the APIs very consistent. So remember, every method in jQuery UI is called like this, and every widget has the methods that I've just listed. Before we close for today, I just want to mention the events that the accordion has. We don't really have time to look at any real examples, but we will do this in a later lesson. But let's at least see how they can be used. So the events the widget fires are active, before active, and create. So these are all the most interesting times in the widget's lifecycle. The create event, by the way, is another aspect of the common API. So all widgets, nearly every single widget calls the create event when it becomes initialized. I think there is one widget that doesn't call it, and I think that's the date picker. Aside from the date picker, every single widget will fire the create event once it's been initialized on the page. So if we wanted to set an event handler that did something after the widget had been initialized, then one way that we could do that is by passing the event handler as part of the configuration object. So we just use the name of the event that we want to bind to as the key, and then we can supply the function, the handler function, as the value. So let's just do a really simple one here. We'll just log a statement to the console. Let's make sure the console is open, and we'll refresh the page, and there's our console message. So that happens as soon as the widget is initialized, and these events can be extremely useful. They're probably one of the best features of the API. So we will be looking at those in more detail in later lessons. So this part has been a little long, for which I apologize, but there's been quite a bit to cover. We've seen the markup that's required by the widget and looked at how the widget is initialized. We've also looked at how we can set different configuration options and what values these options might take. We've seen the shared methods that can be called on any widget, and we saw that the Accordion widget actually doesn't have any unique methods of its own. And we also looked at the events briefly. So just like with many other aspects of JavaScript, there are several different ways that we can add handlers for the events. In this lesson, we looked at adding them as part of the configuration object, but in later lessons, we'll also look at how we can add them using jQuery's on method. In the next lesson, we're going to move on to look at the tabs widget.